All right, well, welcome everybody. I'm really happy today because I got really excited a couple of weeks ago after Daniel Leach delivered his lecture on Percy Shelley, the man who he was, as well as his intention to revive a certain cultural tradition that had really been very well developed by Aeschylus 2,000 years before Shelley lived, the ancient Greek poet and warrior and statesman who wrote Prometheus Bound, really diagnosing the causes of what is the tension in universal history between these two different impulses of the Zeusian impulse of the tyrant that wants to keep humankind ignorant, enslaved, and in total states of fear, living in the mud like a beast in caves with no technology, devoid of the arts of science of music, versus Prometheus, the other impulse that sees the potential of humankind, even though we physically are not, the people in that story were not anything to be very much inspired by of Aeschylus's old story. But despite that, Prometheus, that his very name defines somebody who looks and acts on the future, sees potential, and he sees this divine spark, which he knows could only be actualized to the degree that he defies Zeus's law, which is that mankind must never have access to the knowledge of fire. And after a night of drunken orgies and other things, Zeus is just completely debauched and passed out, which is a time that Prometheus takes as an opportunity to steal the fire, left burning. I guess there's like a perpetual Zeusian fire. And with that, he shares it with man. And in the story, it's very clear that with that comes the knowledge of animal husbandry, navigating over the seas using the stars, all of the sciences, mineralogy, everything. And for that, Prometheus is punished, as we all know. And he's, as far as I can recollect, I think it's something like 10,000 years of perpetual torture of a vulture eating his liver every single day. And he's allowed to get out of it, and he's given chance after chance to simply say, okay, we'll let you off the hook, you can get free of this physical pain, just tell Zeus what will be the cause of his downfall. That's all. You're the only one who knows. And he won't tell. And he's very clear that it's the love of humankind that really is driving him. It's the love that's allowing him to take a greater joy in the health of his soul over the pain of his body. So Shelley was really moved by that at a very young age. He learned, as Dan Leach went through, he studied the classics, he studied ancient Greek, he studied classical, like Latin at a very young age, and it really disciplined his identity and his mind in a way that allowed him to do things that, some people work a whole lifetime to produce one poem of the type that Percy Shelley, though he died at the age of like 31, was able to produce in a high density in his 20s. His friend, John Keats, was very close to him in that sense, and both shared that same passion, that same Promethean spirit. So yeah, Dan Leach messaged us saying that he would have liked to have really been here, but he couldn't, so he apologized. Today, the essay that we're going to read is in defense of poetry, A Defense of Poetry, which was the last prose essay that Shelley had written before he died in 1821. He was born in 1791. And that was a period of a lot of potential, right? The American Revolution had only recently just happened. He had written pamphlets, political pamphlets that he was distributing, 10 of them in the course of his short life, which extolled the virtues and the praises of the American Revolution, called for things like a philosophical society. He himself was born into wealth, so he had some money to put into good projects. He even had put money into a internal improvements project, the building of an early dam in England. He put a lot of effort into funding the Examiner magazine with his friend Leigh Hunt, which was a political and arts and poetry magazine. So he wasn't just a producer of creative works. He put his money behind it, and he put his body behind it too, because he was also on the front lines working to develop essentially unions and also movements against tyranny to try to recover the spirit of the American Revolution. And in one of these pamphlets, he calls very clearly for the creation of societies of culture and philanthropy to create philosopher kings. And he's very clear that the primary battle is in the souls of the people, and that people should hone themselves to become self-perfecting and pursue only conversations that deal with liberty, freedom, justice, and truth, with all of their leisure time. So really hone and refine your passions, and then you can go, because he was talking to a lot of the people who are getting their bodies into mass movements, but they were not getting anywhere. A lot of this was turning into anarchy, right? And that's what we've seen again and again throughout the 200 years after he's died. We've seen a lot of good-hearted people who didn't have they skipped the steps, and they didn't take the time to develop their minds and their hearts and their wisdom. So they start moving on for political action, and they become, before they know it, weaponized mobs that are used by forces above them that they don't understand, right? To overturn social orders that should not be overturned necessarily, and could have been remedied if they had thought about it a little bit more. Like, anyway, that's I have to go off that. So anyway, so this In Defense of Poetry was written in response. So I'll just say this just to get the context. We're going to read this in two sittings, I think. It was written in response to an author named Thomas Love Peacock, who was, we are told by myth makers from Oxford and Cambridge, who are the only ones who are allowed to like sort of narrate the story of history, especially with these cultural warriors. But we're told that he was just a close friend of Shelley. And in fact, they were just great buddies, and they were playfully bantering amongst each other. When you actually look into it, the evidence shows the very opposite. Thomas Love Peacock, who wrote an essay in 1819 called The Four Stages of Poetry, or The Four Ages of Poetry, he was a character who was very nefarious. In the essay itself, they were about the same age, but in Peacock's essay, he argues that poetry might have been useful in the infancy of humankind. When, people were still young, naive, early ancient Greeks, there was a useful purpose for poetry. But in the age of the technological industrial revolution, of the British East India Company, the British Empire, poetry was obsolete. It was like, it's stuff for babies. You can do it when you're a kid, but real men don't do poetry. They don't do those things. And he makes the case why poetry is like cookery, he says. It's like pastry making. It's for your appetites, and that's it. But the real men should only be focused on utilitarian pursuits of law, of become an economist. He said, that's the way to really spend your time well. And when he says economist, he doesn't mean like Henry C. Carey or anything good. He means like John Stuart Mill and Malthus. And you can know that because his whole life, Thomas Peacock spent 30 years of his life, the last 30 years of his life, even more, working as the leading propagandist for the British East India Company. Literally, he was the guy. He worked with James Mill, inner echelon stuff, like very high level. Like you don't get that high without knowing what evil you're a part of. And that's how he spent his life. So this is the guy who wrote this thing. Shelley was so horrified, as were many people, with this thesis, that he wrote his response, A Defense of Poetry, which wasn't published. Nobody would publish it while he was alive. This was 1820. It was only published in 1840 for the first time. And it was only published by Thomas Peacock himself. He decided at a certain point, after sitting on it for 20 years, to let it be published. We don't know if there were edits to it. We don't know if things were taken out or inserted. We don't know that. But it's still a powerful piece. Despite all of that, it's so powerful and it's so insightful that it must be read. We will read that for that reason. So let us I'll do a little screen share, and let me just open up the version that I selected. There we go. All right, just make this bigger. Yeah, and again, just hold in mind too, one thing that's also very important, the reason why a lot of his poems and his essays were not published, including this really incredible essay, I just started reading it tonight, The Philosophical View of Reform, that he published in he wrote it in 1818, but it was never published until 1919, 100 years, which was a pamphlet which goes through his attack on the British, the Bank of England, the British East India Company, Malthus directly. He goes through all of this and he just dismantles it and gets at this is how England has been lost as a nation. And this is what he's trying to resist culturally and politically as well. So the reason why it couldn't be published is because there was a crackdown culturally. There was at the time, keep in mind, the 1814 Congress of Vienna had just happened, which was it was something sparked by the British, the French, the Prussians, the Russians. I forget, there's another monarchy I'm forgetting here. Anyway, I forget. And it was done in 1815 as a way to resolve the problems of the 20 years of Napoleonic wars that had created chaos in Europe and really gave republicanism a very bad name, because that all emanated out of the disaster, the bloodbath of the Jacobin color revolution. And I call it a color revolution because that's what it was in 1789 to 94. It was subverted. So the real Republicans all had their heads cut off. The people who worked with Ben Franklin had their heads cut off. And in the vacuum of leadership, you had a bunch of idiot tyrants who also ended up having little civil wars amongst each other, killing each other in turn, until somebody like a fascist Napoleon could be introduced to restore order. But that idea of order was a global new Roman Empire, which involved basically, endless wars until everyone submitted, which didn't happen. So when Napoleon was put down in 1814-15, that was a point where all of the monarchies, the hereditary institutions said, okay, we have to solve this problem of chaos, of disequilibrium. And that was called the Congress of Vienna. Coming out of that was also the institution of a cultural dictatorship called the Congress of Vienna. Cynthia Chung went through that in her piece recently on the destruction or the clampdown on Russian musicians, starting with Valery Gergiev, who was kicked out of the Vienna orchestra. But this was something which involved creating mass censorship. There were censors placed in every single printing press. Every single university had inquisitors and censors who would fire any teacher that would extol Republican ideas. Books were burned. They were not allowed to be published if they had any ideas like of Benjamin Franklin or Thomas Paine. Poetry could not be published if it had any type of qualities that would spark this type of republicanism. So obviously Shelley was not a very easy to find person as far as a published poet. And many of his poems for that reason did not get published until long after he died. Same thing for Keats. Luckily, he did have some wealth, so he was able to put his money behind his own publishing now and again, but overall that was limited. So just to say, that's the context. That's the context to hold in mind as we now look at what is he talking about of the role and the importance of the poet. So we'll probably do this in maybe two different readers. One person can go for maybe 45 minutes, the other one for 45 minutes, then we'll discuss and stop for today by around 10, maybe 10:15. So who would like to be today's first reader?
I can.
All right.
All right. A defense of poetry. According to one mode of regarding those two classes of mental action, which are called reason and imagination. The former may be considered as mind contemplating the relations born by one thought to another, however produced, and the latter as mind acting upon those thoughts so as to color them with its own light, and composing from them as from elements other thoughts, each containing within itself the principle of its own integrity. The one is I do not know how to pronounce that, or the principle of synthesis, and has for its object those forms which are common to universal nature and existence itself. The other is another Greek word, or principle of analysis, and its action regards the relations of things simply as relations, considering thoughts not as their integral unity, but as the algebraical representations which conduct to certain general results. Reason is the enumeration of quantities already known. Imagination is the perception of the value of those quantities, both separately and as a whole. Reason respects the differences, and imagination the similitudes of things. Reason is to imagination as the instrument to the agent, as the body to the spirit, as the shadow to the substance. Poetry, in a general sense, may be defined to be the expression of the imagination. And poetry is consonant with the origin of man. Man is an instrument over which a series of external and internal impressions are driven, like the alternations of an ever-changing wind over an Aeolian lyre.
Yeah, I think it's a Aeolian lyre.
Aeolian lyre, thank you, which move it by their motion, ever-changing melody. There is a principle within the human being, and perhaps within all sentient beings, which acts otherwise than in the lyre, and produces not melody alone, but harmony, by the internal adjustment of the sounds or motions thus excited to the impressions which excite them. It is as if the lyre could accommodate its chords to the motions of that which strikes them in a determined
Proportion of sound.
Proportion of sound, even as the musician can accommodate his voice to the sound of the lyre. The child at play by itself will express its delight by its voice and motions. The very inflection of the tone and every gesture would bear exact relation to a corresponding antitype, which the pleasurable impressions which awakened it. It will be the reflected image of that impression. And as the lyre trembles and sounds after the wind has died away, so the child seeks by prolonging in its voice and motions the duration of the effect, to prolong also a consciousness of the cause. In relation to the objects which delight a child, these expressions are what poetry is to higher objects. The savage, for the savage is to ages what the child is to years, expresses the emotions produced in him by surrounding objects in a similar manner, and language and gesture, together with plastic or pictorial imitation, become the image of the combined effect of those objects and of his apprehension of them.
Man in society with all his passions and his pleasure. Next comes the...
Yeah, at any point, anyone can simply say, hey, let's stop and ask a question, or let's dissect this, because there's a lot of dense thought compressed, as poets often do, right, into very small spaces. So don't feel shy. Stop, ask if you have a thought, share a thought. That's okay.
Okay. Man in society. Oh,
I just had one thing.
Yeah.
The thing that he's obviously doing, I think everyone kind of catches that, is he's taken something people take for granted, which is what causes our the relationship between the external objective world and the internal subjective world. So what causes our behavior and our ideas, right? Because the British empiricist, this sort of British Empire type of philosopher, would always say we are just the sum total of our senses. That's empiricists. Empiricists say we are just our senses, and we are the impressions, the effect of the impressions of our external world. That's all that shapes who we are and what we can be and what we can do. And so doesn't necessarily agree with that, but he's sort of fleshing out his definitions here and looking at, well, what's a more profound idea of what is shaping, and how do we in turn shape our in response the external world around us, right?
And the imitative become at once the representation.
Okay. Man in society, with all its passions and its pleasures, next becomes the object of the passions and pleasures of man. An additional class of emotions produces the augmented treasure of expressions, and language, gesture, and the imitative arts become at once the representation and the medium, the pencil and the picture, the chisel and the statue, the chord and the harmony. The social sympathies, or those laws from which, as from its elements, society results, begin to develop themselves from the moment that two human beings coexist. The future is contained within the present, as the plant within the seed, and equality, diversity, unity, contrast, mutual dependence become the principles alone capable of affording the motives according to which the will of a social being is determined to action, inasmuch as he is social, and constitute pleasure in sensation, virtue in sentiment, beauty in art, truth in reasoning, and love in the intercourse of kind. Hence men, even in the infancy of society, observe a certain order in their words and actions, distinct from that of the objects and the impressions represented by them, all expressions being subject to the laws of that from which it proceeds. But let us dismiss those more general considerations which might involve an inquiry into the principles of society itself, and restrict our view in the manner in which the imagination is expressed upon its forms. In the youth of the world, men dance and sing and imitate natural objects, observing in these actions, as in all others, a certain rhyme or order. And although all men observe a similar, they observe not the same order in the motions of the dance, in the melody of the song, in the combinations of language, in the series of their imitations of natural objects. For there is a certain order or rhythm belonging to each of these classes of mimetic representation, from which the hearer and the spectator receive an intenser and purer pleasure than from any other. The sense of an approximation to this order has been called taste by modern writers. Every man in the infancy of art observes an order which approximates more or less closely to that from which this highest delight results. But the diversity is not sufficiently marked, as that its graduations should be sensible, except in those instances where the predominance of this faculty of approximation to the beautiful, for so we may be permitted to name the relation between this highest pleasure and its cause, is very great. Those in whom it exists in excess are poets, in the most universal sense of the word, and the pleasure resulting from the manner in which they express the influence of society or nature upon their own minds communicates itself to others and gathers a sort of reduplication from that community. Their language is vitally metaphorical. That is, it marks the before unapprehended relation of things and perpetuates their apprehension until the words which represent them become, through time, signs of portions or classes of thoughts instead of pictures of integral thoughts. And then, if no new poets should arise to create afresh the associations which have been thus disorganized, language will be dead to all the nobler purposes of human intercourse. These similitudes or relations are finally said by Lord Bacon to be the same footsteps of nature impressed upon the various subjects of the world. And he considers the faculty which perceives them as the storehouse of axioms common to all knowledge. In the infancy of society, every author is necessarily a poet, because language itself is poetry, and to be a poet is to apprehend the true and the beautiful, in a word, the good which exists in the relation, subsisting first between existence and perception, and secondly, between perception and expression. Every original language near to its source is in itself the chaos of a cyclic poem. The copiousness of lexicography and the distinctions of grammar are the works of a later age and are merely the catalog and the form of the creation of poetry. But poets, or those who imagine and express this indestructible order, are not only the authors of language and of music, of the dance and architecture and statuary and painting. They are the institutors of laws and the founders of civil society and the inventors of the arts of life and the teachers who draw into a certain
Propinquity? I don't know what that means.
propinquity.
Anybody? Does anybody know what that word means? I feel that RJ might know, but I can't hear her. RJ's on mute.
Not working.
Oh, there you are. Hey.
Propinquity just means that you're close together.
Oh, okay. Oh, thank you, RJ.
And I have to, people are going to be coming in here. I have to close myself off.
Oh, yeah, that's okay. All right.
They'll make a racket when they come in.
Okay.
All right. Who draw into a certain propinquity with the beautiful and the true, that partial apprehension of the agencies of the invisible world, which is called religion. Hence, all original religions are allegorical or susceptible of allegory, and, like Janus, have a double face of false and true. Poets, according to the circumstances of the age and nation in which they appeared, were called, in the earlier epochs of the world, legislators or prophets. A poet essentially comprises and unites both these characters, for he not only beholds intensely the present as it is, and discovers those laws according to which present things ought to be ordered, but he beholds the future in the present, and his thoughts are the germs of the flower and the fruit of latest time. Not that I assert poets to be prophets in the gross sense of the word, or that they can foretell the form as surely as they foreknow the spirit of events. Such is the pretense of superstition, which would make poetry an attribute of prophecy, rather than prophecy an attribute of poetry. A poet participates in the eternal, the infinite, and the one, as far as relates to his conceptions. Time and place and number are not. The grammatical forms which express the moods of time and the difference of persons and the distinction of place are convertible with respect to the highest poetry without injuring it as poetry. And the choruses of Aeschylus and the Book of Job and Dante's Paradise would afford more than any other writings examples of this fact, if the limits of this essay did not forbid citation. The creations of sculpture, painting, and music are illustrations still more decisive. Language, color, form, and religious and civil habits of action are all the instruments and materials of poetry. They may be called poetry by that figure of speech which considers the effect as a synonym of the cause. But poetry, in a more restricted sense, expresses those arrangements of language, especially the metrical language, which are created by that imperial faculty, whose throne is curtained within the invisible nature of man. And this springs from the nature itself of language, which is a more direct representation of the actions and passions of our internal being, and it is susceptible of more various and delicate combinations than color, form, or motion, and is more plastic and obedient to the control of that faculty of which it is the creation. For language is arbitrarily produced by the imagination and has relation to thoughts alone. But all other materials, instruments, and conditions of art have relations among each other, which limit and interpose between conception and expression. The former is as a mirror which reflects, the latter as a cloud which enfeebles, the light of which both are mediums of communication. Hence the fame of sculptors, painters, and musicians, although the intrinsic powers of the great masters of these arts may yield in no degree to that of those who have employed language as the hieroglyphic of their thoughts, has never equaled that of poets in the restricted sense of the term, as two performers of equal skill will produce unequal effects from a guitar and a harp. The fame of legislators and founders of religions, so long as their institutions last, alone seems to exceed that of poets in the restricted sense. But it can scarcely be a question whether, if we deduct the celebrity which their flattery of gross opinions of the vulgar usually conciliates, together with that which belonged to them in their higher character of poets, any excess will remain. We have thus circumscribed the word poetry within the limits of that art which is the most familiar and the most perfect expression of the faculty itself. It is necessary, however, to make the circle still narrower and to determine the distinction between measured and unmeasured language. For the popular division into prose and verse is inadmissible in accurate philosophy. Sounds as well as thoughts have relation both between each other and towards that which they represent, and a perception of the order of those relations has always been found connected with the perception of the order of the relations of thoughts. Hence the language of poets has ever affected a certain uniform and harmonious recurrence of sound, without which it were not poetry, and which is scarcely less indispensable to the communication of its influence than the words themselves, without reference to that peculiar order. Hence the vanity of the translation. It were as wise to cast a violet into a crucible that you might discover in the formal principle of its color and odor, and seek to transfuse from one language into it, as to seek to transfuse from one language into another the creation of a poet. The plant must spring again from its seed, or it will bear no flower. And this is the burthen of the curse of Babel.
Yeah. You guys get any questions so far? Are you guys following pretty okay? I think that last point he made on the challenge to the translator is good, because it shows why things like artificial intelligence will always be qualitatively limited. Because if you put like a translation of like a poem into a Google Translate, no matter how good your translation software algorithms, it's from one language to another. It might translate the words, but it'll be nonsensical if you translate like an Arab poem into French or into English, right? So I like just his approach to get across that even the translator has to themselves have that same spark that was in the heart of the original poet, because you have to find a way to make the metaphor come alive in your own cultural and linguistic context for it to make any sense or have impact. You can't just do a literal word for word translation. So it's goes deeper than the words.
An observation of the regular mode of the recurrence of harmony in the language of poetical minds, together with its relation to music, produced metre, or a certain system of traditional forms of harmony and language. Yet it is by no means essential that a poet should accommodate his language to this traditional form, so that the harmony, which is its spirit, be observed. The practice is indeed convenient and popular, and to be preferred, especially in such composition as includes much action. But every great poet must inevitably innovate upon the example of his predecessors in the exact structure of his peculiar versification. The distinction between poets and prose writers is a vulgar error. The distinction between philosophers and poets has been anticipated. Plato was essentially a poet. The truth and splendor of his imagery and the melody of his language are the most intense that it is possible to conceive. He rejected the measure of the epic, dramatic, and lyrical forms, because he sought to kindle a harmony in thoughts divested of shape and action, and he forbore to invent any regular plan of rhythm, which would include, under determinate forms, the varied pauses of his style. Cicero sought to imitate the cadence of his periods, but with little success. Lord Bacon was a poet. His language has a sweet and majestic rhythm, which satisfies the sense, no less than the almost superhuman wisdom of his philosophy has satisfied the intellect. It is a strain which distends and then bursts the circumference of the reader's mind and pours itself forth together with it into the universal element with which it has perpetual sympathy. All the authors of revolutions in opinion are not only necessarily poets as they are inventors, not even as their words unveil the permanent analogy of things by images which participate in the life of truth, but as their periods are harmonies and rhythmical and contain in themselves the elements of verse, being the echo of the eternal music. Nor are those supreme poets who have employed traditional forms of rhythm on account of the form and action of their subjects less capable of perceiving and teaching the truth of things than those who have omitted that form. Shakespeare, Dante, and Milton, to confine ourselves to modern writers, are philosophers of the very loftiest power. A poem is the very image of life expressed in its eternal truth. There is this difference between a story and a poem, that a story is a catalog of detached facts which have no other connection than time, place, circumstance, cause, and effect. The other is the creation of actions according to the unchangeable forms of human nature, as existing in the mind of the creator, which is itself the image of all other minds. The one is partial and applies only to a definite period of time and a certain combination of events, which can never again recur. The other is universal and contains within itself the germ of a relation to whatever motives or actions have place in the possible varieties of human nature. Time, which destroys the beauty and the use of the story of particular facts, stripped of the poetry which should invest them, augments that of poetry, and forever develops new and wonderful applications of the eternal truth which it contains. Hence, epitomes have been called the moths of just history. They eat out the poetry of it. A story of particular facts is a mirror which obscures and distorts that which should be beautiful. Poetry is a mirror which makes beautiful that which is distorted.
Yeah, you can think of just almost any academic treatise on history that's currently published. You could just know, just by trying to read some of these tomes, that just, will take like a little period of some random point in history and just pump out 800 pages of dry, descriptive material, and just nitpicking every little iota of information. And your mind just is nulled. Like, you need so much stamina to get through some of these things, versus like Shakespeare's histories, or something which really engages your mind and gives you an insight into the causal spirit of a process of history more truthfully. It's you can just see, like, these things that they publish today, they're going to be, no one's going to read them in 5 or 10 or 20 or even 100 years. Like, they're going to be swept away. They have no durability. But something like Homer's epics or Dante, these just endure. That just very interesting.
Yeah, you see, like, even Shakespeare, it's like, how was he able to do so many plays all in blank verse?
Yeah,
like, fit each line is just amazing.
Yeah, I know, exactly. Yeah, they just contain like such, they you can't read it and be a passive consumer of information. If you are, you're not going to understand anything that he says. It sort of forces your mind to become to get into motion and start creating imageries actively in your own head, right? Which, just by doing that, the fire starts. It's a very interesting thing.
Yeah. The parts of a composition may be poetical without the composition as a whole being a poem. A single sentence may be considered as a whole, though it may be found in the midst of a series of unassimilated portions. A single word even may be a spark of the indistinguishable thought. And thus all the great histories, Herodotus, Plutarch, Livy, were poets. And although the plan of these writers, especially that of Livy, restrained them from developing this faculty in its highest degree, they made copious and ample amends for their subjection by filling all the intricacies of their subjects with living images. Having determined what is poetry and who are poets, let us proceed to estimate its effect upon society. Poetry is ever accompanied with pleasure. All spirits upon which it falls open themselves to receive the wisdom which is mingled with its delight. In the infancy of the world, neither poets themselves nor their auditors are fully aware of the excellence of poetry, for it acts as a divine and unapprehended manner, beyond and above consciousness. And it is reserved for future generations to contemplate and measure the mighty cause and effect in all the strength and splendor of their union. Even in modern times, no living poet ever arrived at the fullness of his fame. The jury which sits in judgment upon a poet, belonging as he does to all time, must be composed of his peers. It must be impaneled by time from the selectest of the wise of many generations. A poet is a nightingale who sits in darkness and sings to cheer its own solitude with sweet sounds. His auditors are as men entranced by the melody of an unseen musician, who feel that they are moved and softened, yet know not whence or why. The poets and poems of Homer and his contemporaries were the delight of the infant Greece. They were the elements of that social system, which is the column upon which all succeeding civilization has. Homer embodied the ideal perfection of his age in human character, nor can we doubt that those who read his verse were awakened to an ambition of becoming like to Achilles, Hector, and Ulysses. The truth and beauty of friendship, patriotism, and persevering devotion to an object were unveiled to the depths of these immortal creations.
Oh shit! Oops. Sorry,
Where are we?
I screwed up. Here we are.
Yeah. This the sentiments of the auditors must have been refined and enlarged by a sympathy with such great and lovely impersonations, until from admiring they imitated, and from imitation they identified themselves with the object of their admiration. Nor let it be objected that these characters are remote from a moral perfection, and that they can by no means be considered as edifying patterns for general imitation. Every epoch, under names more or less spacious, has defined its
Deified.
deified its particular errors. Revenge is the naked idol of the worship of a semi-barbarous age. The self-deceit is the veiled image of unknown evil, before which luxury and satiety lie prostrate. But a poet considers the vices of his contemporaries as the temporary dress in which his creations must be arrayed, and which cover without concealing the eternal proportions of their beauty. An epic or dramatic personage is understood to wear them around his soul, as he may the ancient armor or the modern uniform around his body, whilst it is easy to conceive a dress more graceful than either. The beauty of the eternal nature.
Internal.
Oh, internal, yeah. Nature cannot be so far concealed by its accidental vesture, but that the spirit of its form shall communicate itself to the very disguise, and indicate the shape it hides from, the manner in which it is worn. A majestic form and graceful motions will express themselves through the most barbarous and tasteless costume. Few poets of the highest class have chosen to exhibit the beauty of their conceptions in its naked truth and splendor, and it is doubtful whether the alloy of costume, habit, etc., be not necessary to temper this planetary music for mortal ears. The whole objection, however, of the immortality of poetry rests upon a misconception of the manner in which poetry acts to produce the moral improvements of man. Ethical science arranges the elements which poetry has created, and propounds schemes and proposes examples of civil and domestic life. Nor is it for want of admirable doctrines that men hate and despise and censure and deceive and subjugate one another. But poetry acts in another and diviner manner. It awakens and enlarges the mind itself by rendering it the receptacle of 1,000 unapprehended combinations of thought. Poetry lifts the veil from the hidden beauty of the world, makes familiar objects to be as if they were not familiar, and reproduces all it represents, and the impersonations clothed in its Ellison light stand thenceforward in the minds of those who have once contemplated them as memorials of that gentle and exalted content which extends itself over all thoughts and actions with which it coexists. The great secret of morals is love, or a going out of our nature, and an identification of ourselves with the beautiful which exists in thought, action, or person not our own. A man to be greatly good must imagine intensely and comprehensively. He must put himself in the place of another and of many others. And the pains and pleasures of his species must become his own. Just take a drink of water. The great instrument of moral goods is the imagination, and poetry administers to the effect by acting upon the cause. Poetry enlarges the circumference of the imagination by replenishing it with thoughts of ever new delight, which have the power of attracting and assimilating to their own nature all other thoughts, and which form new intervals and intricacies.
Interstices.
Interstices?
Interstices. It's a weird word. It just means, I think, it's another way I think of saying intervals, right? Like you're building new combinations. So a new metaphor, an idea will allow you to all of a sudden, when you realize, because you have to think like that's not literally what's being said. So what is he trying to say by that imagery? And when you come to the discovery, that new idea reassociates, or it creates a new set of associations in your mind of ideas that were maybe floating around that didn't have a connection. All of a sudden you have connections, right? That are all of a sudden there because of that imagery becoming a discovery. So I think he's he's using this sort of language of harmony, of rhythm, of to try to get across how the mind actually has a certain geometry that moves and grows in a lawful way.
That's interesting.
Yeah.
Which
Yeah,
form?
I would have a short comment.
Yeah.
I think that those intervals and interstices precisely are the very precious space in the mind that would allow it to receive the true forms instead of repeating the same things that has been given by instruction. So I know that there are many ways to explain the difference between instruction and education, but instruction is precisely the social brainwashing, if you want, or cramming, and some social cramming quite good. I think that is not necessarily an antisocial thing that I am stating now. But, even with the cramming, creativity is not possible if the person is not capable to have those intervals within which that person will receive precisely the eternal forms. Okay, I would say that it may be a practical way to understand poetry, because a true poet precisely is the one capable to receive the eternal forms of truth. And those eternal forms of truth, goodness, and beauty are not something that is given by a social framework, but by the whole universe.
That's good.
So interstices is a very, how can I say it, low level word. I would have prefer space.
Well, he sort of did earlier, where a sentence earlier where he said the greatest instrument of moral good is the imagination, and poetry administers to that effect by acting upon the cause, and it enlarges the circumference of the imagination, which in my mind thinks it's sort of like a spatial increase, right? The space of what you. Maybe it's not exactly what you're.
Yeah, or maybe he's a bit humorous, because interstices interstices is a small space. Okay, so he said try to slip into those small spaces and make them bigger.
Mhm. Right. And we didn't even finish the sentence, right? And whose
Yeah.
void forever craves fresh food. Yes.
Yeah.
There's always this hunger to fill the void with substance. There's no such thing as just empty space in that sense. It's always hungry for more quality, right? To be spiritually consumed.
Okay, so, and which form new intervals and interstices, whose void forever craves fresh food. Poetry strengthens the faculty, which is the organ of the moral nature of man, and the same manner as exercise in the same manner as exercise strengthens a limb. A poet, therefore, would do ill to embody his own conceptions of right and wrong, which are usually those of his place and time, in his poetical creation, which participates in neither. By this assumption of the inferior office of interpreting the effect, in which perhaps after all he might acquit himself, but imperfectly, he would resign a glory and a participation in the cause. There was little danger that Homer, or any of the eternal poets, pardon me, should have so far misunderstood themselves as to have abdicated this throne of their wisest dominion. Those in whom the poetical faculty, though great, is less intense, as Euripides, Lucan, Tasso, Spencer, have frequently affected a moral aim, and the effect of their poetry is diminished in exact proportion with the degree in which they compel us to avert this purpose. By the way,
you guys think of go on.
Yeah, I kind of think I've reached the end of my rope right now for reading. So if we could do a switch off now.
Yeah, let's perfectly good time, good instinct. What do you guys think of this idea that he's getting out of poetry shouldn't strive for a moral aim? Does that sound right? Or what do you think he's talking about there?
Yeah, it sounds perfectly right because morality is something taught and axiology or ethics is something received. So we all know perfectly that you cannot make someone moral by speech and by preaching because it's another form of cramming. And most of the time, the people receiving the cramming would simply vomit it in a way or in another. So the only way to make people moral, in my understanding, is to bring them to truth, goodness, and beauty, and they will be spontaneously moral. And that is precisely the role of true poetry. I don't know if you remember a scene from the movie Shakespeare in Love. You got a preacher who was quite sanctimonious and preaching to people who go to Shakespeare theater. We surprise him at the moment watching a play by Shakespeare, and his face completely unlightened by the play. Okay, so he became spontaneously moral at that moment because he was being brought to truth, goodness, and beauty, and not receiving the preaching of someone like him.
What would you consider something like, I guess from that standpoint, would we put Aesop and his fables into the category of like the lower order poets? As I haven't read Lucan or Euripides or Tasso or Spencer. I did read a bit of Spencer, but I guess that's sort of like that, or is it different? Is that also because you're getting at a more? There's always a moral lesson embedded in every simple little poetic story.
Precisely. I think the beauty is in the eye of the beholder. Okay, because we can put Jean de La Fontaine, for example, in the same category, and apparently Jean de La Fontaine has been quite inspired by his fables. It's not the same. It's not of the same breadth than Plato's dialogues, of course. But I dare to say that all the Jean de La Fontaine fables is a high quality psychology and philosophical teaching. If you truly devote yourself to study the fables of Jean de La Fontaine.
You got to do that, and I didn't do it. What do you guys have any other thoughts to about this, Jerry or John or RJ?
Yeah, kind of.
Yeah.
Am I on?
Yeah.
Our discussion here really, it wasn't to any great purpose. We all certainly knew that you can take a fable, and if you are enough of a poet, you will take it up to the supreme beauty. And I guess what I'm trying to say, there are a lot of other things in this that I don't understand, and I don't have any trouble with Aesop's fables. So let's get going.
Yeah. Absolutely. Yeah, and I think, Quan, you're totally right, dead on. Absolutely. I think, yeah, as soon as you sort of try to lecture somebody and tell them exactly what to think, it's not going to have very much of an impact. But obviously, if you can garb your idea in some metaphorical language that will then activate, like he was saying, we could showcase these characters in Homer have vices, but we celebrate their virtues. We actually we're inspired to become more like some of these characters, but they're not perfect people. They're all full of vices. And so we appreciate their virtues when we see them contrasted with their vices, and we see the potential that they could be not actualized, right? And so it becomes more of a living thing that way, which is Shakespeare all the way, right? That's everything Shakespeare does, is like potential that could have been gone awry by folly, and like great people who could have been great just wasted their opportunities because they had something they couldn't deal with inside themselves, or they didn't examine.
I think it's like, oh, sorry, keep.
Oh, I was just thinking, you take Romeo and Juliet as a perfect example of like love gone wrong, and how Shakespeare just shows how bad it can get, and so that's what I thought of personally.
Mm-hmm.
Yeah. But let's not forget that Romeo and Juliet, they were 13 and a half and 14 and a half. We often imagine Romeo and Juliet of being people of 22 or 24. They were 14 and 13. So it's very interesting because it's the purest form of teenager love. Okay, I don't call it infatuation, because it could be interpreted as infatuation, but it's rather a tragedy of two teenagers involved in a social and family structure, even if there are more layers to interpret Romeo and Juliet, of course. But my main obsession is always to say to people that don't imagine Romeo and Juliet being in their 20s. Okay, Romeo was 14 and Juliet was 13.
Right. Well, also with Shakespeare, the beauty there as well is he takes a particular case study of two individuals and showcases their dynamics and how tragic this whole thing unfolds. But really, what he's getting you to, like, what does the audience walk away with after that experience of Romeo and Juliet? Is, did any of that have to happen? And so much of their circumstances was also being shaped by these irrational grievances between their two like warring factions and families, who have all of these absurd irrational expectations, which is a reflection of bigger problems that nations face between France and Germany. And like, this is something which we see reflected on many levels of society, which is at the heart of many of the unnecessary conflicts that create so many wars in the world, right? Which empires are always able to sort of capitalize on as well.
Well, I would like to remind our short discussion on Schiller's universal history text. Okay, once again, it's the whim of fate plus the attempt to make appear a kairos.
Mm.
Okay, and on the smaller scale, Romeo and Juliet was attempting to make appear a kairos by love story within the framework of fate, which is their social frame, their social and their family obligations. I would say that maybe we should put Romeo and Juliet should be played in the morning, and Julius Caesar in the afternoon.
Sounds good. Yeah, well, when we set up a theater company, you're going to be in charge of setting up the scheduling, the curriculum.
Yeah, sure. And the company would be called Kairos.
Good. That's very good. Kronos and Kairos. All right. So who wants to be who wants to pick up the torch? Oh, by the way, hey Jonathan, good to meet you.
Hi, nice to meet you all. I'm new to this, so I don't really have any kind of background, literature background. So I just logged in to listen and maybe learn, and hopefully I get into the whole poetry and literature stuff.
It's inevitable. Yeah, and you're not going to catch, nobody's going to catch all of the elements of what he's bringing up, but I think we're all just striving to get the general core idea, and we're, feel free to stop and ask a question or just flesh out an idea if it's really juicy. Same thing. Hey, Gerald, just saw you there too. We're about midway through, so we're just taking turns. You know what we're reading today? You got the introduction of Shelley's In Defense of Poetry, and why poets really are necessary, where many people in his age were beginning to believe that poets were an obsolete phenomenon. So who wants to be the next reader?
I can be the next reader.
Oh, certainly.
Okay, so I think Homer and the Cyclic Poets, if I'm not mistaken.
Correct.
Okay. Anyway, if it's too choppy, you tell me, but I think that now that problem is less and less a problem. Okay, so Homer and the Cyclic Poets will follow at a certain interval by the dramatic and lyrical poets of Athens, who flourish contemporaneously with all that is most perfect in the kindred expressions of the poetical faculty: architecture, painting, music, the dance, sculpture, philosophy, and we may add the form of civil life. For although the scheme of Athenian society was deformed by many imperfections, which the poetry existing in chivalry and Christianity has erased from the habits and institutions of modern Europe, yet never at any other period has so much energy, beauty, and virtue been developed. Never was blind strength and stubborn form so disciplined and rendered subject to the will of man, or that will less repugnant to the dictates of the beautiful and the true, as during the century which preceded the death of Socrates. Of no other epoch in the history of our species have we record and fragments stamped so visibly with the image of the divinity in man. But it is poetry alone, in form, in action, or in language, which has rendered this epoch memorable above all others, and the storehouse of examples so everlasting time. For written poetry existed at that epoch simultaneously with the other arts. And it is an idle inquiry to demand which gave and which received the light, which all, as from a common focus, have scattered over the darkest periods of succeeding time. We know no more of cause and effect than a constant conjunction of events. Poetry is ever found to coexist with whatever other arts contribute to the happiness and perfection of man. I appeal to what has already been established, distinguished between the cause and the effect. It was at the period here adverted to that the drama had its birth. And however, a succeeding writer may have equal or surpassed those few great specimens of the Athenian drama, which has been preserved to us. It is indisputable that the art itself never was understood or practiced according to the true philosophy of it, as at Athens. For the Athenians employ language, action, music, painting, the dance, and religious institutions to produce a common effect in the representation of the highest idealism of passion and of power. Each division in the art was made perfect in its kind of artist of the most consummate skill and was disciplined into a beautiful proportion and unity, one towards the other. On the modern stage, a few only of the elements capable of expressing the image of the poet's conception are employed at once. We have tragedy without music and dancing, and music and dancing without the highest impersonation of which they are the fit accompaniment, and both without religion and solemnity. Religious institution has indeed been usually banished from the stage. Our system of divesting the actor's face of a mask on which the many expressions appropriated to his dramatic character might be molded to one permanent and unchanging expression is favorable only to a partial and inharmonious effect. It is fit for nothing but a monologue where all the attention may be directed to some great master of ideal mimicry. The modern practice of blending comedy with tragedy, though liable to great abuse in point of practice, is undoubtedly an extension of the dramatic circle, but the comedy should be, as in King Lear, universal, ideal, and sublime. It is perhaps the intervention of this principle which determines the balance in favor of King Lear against the Oedipus Tyrannus or the Agamemnon, or, if you will, the trilogies with which they are connected, unless the intense power of choral poetry, especially that of the latter, should be considered as restoring the equilibrium. King Lear, if it can sustain this comparison, may be judged to be the most perfect specimen of the dramatic art existing in the world. In spite of the narrow conditions in which the poet was subjected by the ignorance of the philosophy of the drama, which has prevailed in modern Europe, Candon, in his religious autos, has attempted to fulfill some of the high conditions of dramatic representation neglected by Shakespeare, such as the establishing a relation between the drama and religion and the accommodating them to music and dancing. But he omits the observations of conditions still more important and more it lost than gained by the substitution of the rigidly defined and ever repeated idealisms of a distorted superstition for the living impersonations of the truth of human action, passion. But I digress. The connection of scenic exhibitions with the improvement or corruption of the manners of man has been universally recognized. In other words, the presence or absence of poetry in its most perfect and universal form has been found to be connected with good and evil in conduct or habit. The corruption which has been imputed to the drama of an effect begins when the poetry employed in its constitution ends. I appeal to the history of manners, whether the periods of the growth of the one and the decline of the other have not corresponded with an exactness equal to any example of moral cause and effect. And here I would like to make a short comment on the first lines of this paragraph. Because when Shelley said that the connection of scenic exhibitions with the improvement or corruption of the manners of man has been universally recognized, and that's the effect of kataxis, okay? And we all know the Greek word kataxis means, it's not a very nice meaning, but it means literally diarrhea, okay?
Okay.
So the effect of diarrhea or mental relief, okay, maybe a nicer way to say rather than diarrhea, let's say relief, okay? We don't need to precise what kind of relief. So that kind of public relief induced by a representation of something is precisely to make the people watching that play to become aware of what is happening in their mind, their city, or their nation, or their empire. Okay, and you doesn't matter the name of the framework in which they live. And precisely, many of the Greek tragedies were related to historical events. Okay, for example, during the Persian War, many of the Greek playwrights wrote a play maybe 2 weeks or a month after a battle or after some great tragedy. And it had precisely the effect to provide the occasion, the framework for that public relief, and to enhance the cohesiveness of the citizens, and to make them more capable of a sound thinking. Because of course, after that tragedy or after that battle, most of the time the people in the city had to take a decision concerning what we are doing next. And sometimes the play was written like 2 days after major battles, and that public representation contributed immensely to the mental health of the citizens and to their capacity to take the right next decision.
That's a very good point. Yeah, and his idea, as we read earlier, his concept and definition of what a poet is not, it would, I think a lot of people who consider themselves poets would fall far below that standard that he laid out, which is a very high bar, right? Where he says earlier on that poets are those who see the future in the seeds of the present. So they don't look at and comment on the present, but they have the ability to see potential of the future, and they participate in the infinite and the one. They're not bounded by temporal constraints, right, in their time or space, but they're always using they're wrapping their stories or their creations in the garb of their present, but they're always looking to that universal, eternal quality of ideas that is above their particular temporal period in time. So if you have those instincts, then going into it with what you've just said, and then the absence of that character in drama. So if you take that out and you just have drama for entertainment's sake, what do you have? But as he says the corruption which has been imputed to the drama as an effect begins when the poetry employed in its constitution ends. So when that's gone, look at Netflix today. How much universality do we have in the average story on Netflix?
Well, Netflix is conditioning us to other stuff. I would say that that capacity to mesmerize the mind of people is still there, but not necessarily to truth, goodness, beauty. And I would say that the ancient Greeks, when they write the plays, it was a brilliant way to make people think by themselves and to produce the solutions, rather than for the upper class to come to them and to say, here are the solutions that we found, and you have to follow those solutions. It was a very brilliant upper class, capable to create a play, a piece of art, to make the people walk the mental process to arrive at the same solution, rather than being preached to those solutions that they would feel that they are forced to follow.
Good point. Right. Very good.
But I would like to say also that I want to be realistic too, because I don't want to pass for a mad idealist. Athens, I think that there was maybe 10,000 citizens in Athens. What was possible in Athens?
I don't know.
I would say maybe it would be possible in big countries nowadays, but it would take a government that would take culture very seriously.
Mm-hmm. Also, one thing to keep in mind is this golden age of Athens that he's referring to was a very small period before the death of Socrates, which was like he's saying here, maybe, between Homer and the death of Socrates is that period, which was maybe 130, 140 years of that quality.
Yeah.
It didn't continue. So, yeah.
The 5 to 6 generations of shining enlightenment, and after it's finished. So
they couldn't keep
okay,
the flame alive. Yeah.
Yeah, I keep on. The drama at Athens, or wheresoever else it may have approach to its perfection, ever coexisted with the moral and intellectual greatness of the age. The tragedies of the Athenian poets are as mirrors in which the spectator beholds himself under a thin disguise of circumstance, stripped of all but that ideal perfection and energy which everyone feels to be the internal type of all that he loves, admires, and would become. The imagination is enlarged by a sympathy with pains and passions so mighty that they distend in their conception the capacity of that by which they are conceived. The good affections are strengthened by pity, indignation, terror, and sorrow. And an exalted calm is prolonged from the society of this high exercise of them into the tumult of familiar life. Even crime is disarmed of half its horror and all its contagion by being represented as the fatal consequence of the unfathomable agencies of nature. Error is thus divested of its wistfulness. Man can no longer cherish it as the creation of their choice. In the drama of the highest order, there is little food for censure or hatred. It teaches rather self-knowledge and self-respect. Neither the eye nor the mind can be itself, unless reflected upon that which it resembles. The drama, so long as it continues to express poetry, is as a prismatic and many-sided mirror which collects the bright rays of human nature and divides and reproduces them from the simplicity of these elementary forms and touches them with majesty and beauty and multiplies all that it reflects and endows it with the power of propagating its light wherever it may fall. But in periods of the decay of social life, the drama sympathizes with that decay. Tragedy becomes a cold imitation of the form of the great masterpieces of antiquity, divested of all harmonious accompaniment of the kindred arts, and often the very form misunderstood or a weak attempt to teach certain doctrines which the writer considers as moral truths, and which are usually no more than specious flatteries of some gross vice or weakness with which the author, in common with its auditors, are infected. Hence, what has been called the classical and domestic drama. Addison's Cato is a specimen of the one, and would it were not superfluous to cite examples of the other. I such the to such purpose, poetry cannot be made subservient. Poetry is a sword of lightning, ever unsheathed, which consumes the scabbard that would contain it. Very poetical. And thus we observe that all dramatic writings of this nature are unimaginative in a singular degree. They affect sentiment and passion, which, divested of imagination, are other names, caprice and appetite. The period in our own history of the grossest degradation of the drama is the reign of Charles II, when all forms in which poetry has been accustomed to be expressed became hymns to the triumph of kingly power over liberty and virtue. Milton stood alone, illuminating an age unworthy of him. At such periods, the calculating principle pervades all the forms of dramatic exhibition, and poetry ceases to be expressed upon them. Comedy loses its ideal universality, wit succeeds to humor. We laugh from self-complacency and triumph instead of pleasure. Malignity, sarcasm, and contempt succeed to sympathetic merriment. We hardly laugh, but we smile. Obscenity, which is ever blasphemy against the divine beauty of life, becomes, from the very veil which it assumes, more active if less disgusting. It is a monster for which the corruption of society forever brings forth new food, which is divorce in secret. The drama.
There's just a quick thought
Yes.
there, because there's a young musician that I think most people have encountered at some point named Alma Deutsche. Has everyone heard Alma Deutsche, the young girl prodigy? No? Shake your heads no if you haven't. I'll send a
Yes.
link. Okay. All right. RJ certainly has. What's fantastic about this girl who's been composing these symphonies, right, and operas since she was like 5 years old, like an incredible character. You wouldn't imagine that she should exist in our current dysfunctional age. It's an anomaly. But she had a very loving parent, and there's a documentary going through her educational experience as a homeschooled child reading Shakespeare, a really great teacher of music as well, who they found to work with her. So it makes sense. She's not a robot. She gives an interview at one point when she's like 12, saying that she's being told Now, this is obviously we're talking about drama, and she's a musician, but it's very similar still. But she's being told by all of these like art, these musical academics, that her music, which she strives to be like, she's inspired by Mozart and Schubert, and they're all telling her that it's naive and obsolete what she's doing, and it's just because she's so young and she doesn't realize how ugly the world is. That's why she's doing this stuff. But she shouldn't do it. When she's more mature, they promise her that she's going to produce more ugly or dissonant atonal music. And she says, I listen to the news. This isn't a surprise. I know the world has wars and ugliness and injustice. I know that, but I don't want to be a mirror of that ugliness. I feel that I have beauty inside me, and I want that beauty to go out because I want the world to be a better place. I don't want to be a reflection of that ugliness, which is the exact opposite of the Frankfurt School, right? All of the musical theoreticians that gave birth to, not because it's not just critical race theory that came out of the Frankfurt School. It's also the philosophy of the arts, of literature, how we should do history. It all came out of this same nasty school of anti-humanists who, in the musical program, Theodor Adorno, he was of the view philosophically, almost religiously, that proper art, acceptable art, should only be ugly art because our world is ugly and art should be the mirror of the world. And of course, if that becomes your standard and that's the only thing you fund and pour money into, and that becomes, exhibits around the world or film productions, of course, your society is going to be made even worse and worse. It's going to be like a self-reflective or a self-referential decay. You're just going to, so what he's saying, what Shelley's saying here, I just find it so timeless because it's almost like he's talking directly in my mind to the 20th century. And he's already like pinpointing this problem, this insanity of art becoming a mirror of the corruption of the age.
Yes, necessarily.
Mm-hmm. And even comedy just losing, it says you smile, but you don't laugh anymore. And if you do, it's for obscenity. So the quality of comedy is just, it's decaying quite a bit compared to what we're capable of.
Absolutely. I continue?
Sure.
The drama being that form under which a greater number of modes of expression of poetry are susceptible of being combined than any other, the connection of poetry and social good is more observable in the drama than in whatever other form. And it is indisputable that the highest perfection of human society has ever corresponded with the highest dramatic excellence. And that the corruption or the extinction of the drama in a nation where it has once flourished is a mark of a corruption of manners and an extinction of the energies which sustain the soul of social life. But as Machiavelli says of political institutions, that life may be preserved and renewed. And if man should arise capable of bringing back the drama to its principles. And this is true with respect to poetry in its most extended sense. All language, institution, and form require not only to be produced, but to be sustained. The office and character of a poet participate in the divine nature as regards providence, no less than as regards creation. And this little phrase that it need to be sustained reminds me of one of your line in the Canadian Patriot, that democracy is not something that you own forever. And that democracy is something that depends at each generation of the quality of the citizenry of the citizens, meaning that you can have an empty label of democracy, but if you don't have a democratic man or aristocratic man, there is no democracy if you have a label on the nation.
And just so people know, when Kwan says aristocratic man, He's not referring it to the negative sense that we all usually have. He means the literal sense of the rule by the best. So just the wisest people. That's the Greek definition. Because I've had some messages when people have heard you speak, and they don't know how you think, Quan, and they just heard you extolling the virtues of a society ruled by aristocrats, and they're horrified. They're like, "Who's this guy?" And I'm like, "No, don't worry. He's a Platonist."
Matt, you just answered that I'm a oligarch having infiltrated your group. That's all. That being said, a civil war, the spoils of Asia, and the fatal predominance first of the Macedonian and then of the Roman arms were so many symbols of the extinction or suspension of the creative faculty in Greece. The bucolic writers who found patronage under the latter tyrants of Sicily and Egypt were the latest representatives of its most glorious reign. Their poetry is intensely melodious, like the order of the tuberose. It overcomes and sickens the spirit with excess of sweetness, whilst the poetry of the preceding age was as a meadow gale of June, which mingles the fragrance of all the flowers in the field and adds a quickening and harmonizing spirit of its own, which endows the sense with a power of sustaining its extreme delight. The bucolic and erotic delicacy in written poetry is correlative with that softness in statuary, music, and the kindred arts, and even in manners and institutions, which distinguish the epoch in which I now refer. Nor is it the poetical faculty itself, or any misapplication of it, to which this one of harmony is to be imputed. An equal sensibility to the influence of the senses and the affections is to be found in the writings of Homer and Sophocles. The former, especially, has clothed sensual and pathetic images with irresistible attractions. Their superiority over these succeeding writers consists in the presence of those thoughts which belong to the inner faculties of our nature, not in the absence of those which are connected with the external. Their incomparable perfection consists in the harmony of the union of all. It is not what the erotic poets have, but what they have not, in which their imperfection consists. It is not as much as they were poets, but is not as much as they were not poets that they can be considered with any plausibility as connected to the corruption of their age.
Right. And that's an important point, because he's touching on an argument that was then being made, that many people like him were saying poetry is the cause of the improvement of society looking at history. And then other people would say to him, well, but look at the times where you had this corruption and decay of these different periods in society, that they also had poetry. So then you could say that the poetry is also the destruction of society. And thus you're wrong, Shelley. So Shelley's addressing that way of thinking, right? And he's saying, no, it's to the degree that these are not poets that age was corrupted. It wasn't because you can't put the blame on poetry for the society's destruction. Just to make that nuance clear.
Had the corruption availed so as to extinguish in them the sensibility to pleasure, passion, and natural scenery, which is imputed to them as an imperfection, the last triumph of evil would have been achieved. For the end of social corruption is to destroy all sensibility to pleasure, and therefore it is corruption. It begins at the imagination and the intellect as at the core, and distributes itself thence as a paralyzing venom through the affections into the very appetites, until all become a torpid mass in which hardly sense survives. At the approach of such a period, poetry even addresses itself to those faculties which are the last to be destroyed, and its voice is heard like the footsteps of Astrea departing from the world. Poetry ever communicates all the pleasure which men are capable of receiving. It is ever still the light of life, the source of whatever of beautiful or generous or true can have place in an evil time. It will readily be confessed that those among the luxurious citizens of Syracuse and Alexandria who were delighted with the poems of Theocritus were less cold, cruel, and sensual than the remnant of their tribe. But corruption must utterly have destroyed the fabric of human society before poetry can ever cease. The sacred links of that change have never been entirely disjoined, which descending through the minds of many men is attached to those great minds, whence, as from a magnet, the invisible effluence is sent forth, which at once connects, animates, and sustains the life of all. It is the faculty which contains within itself the seeds at once of zone and social renovation. And let us not circumscribe the effects of bucolic and erotic poetry within the limits of the sensibility of those to whom it was addressed. They may have perceived the beauty of those immortal compositions simply as fragments and isolated portions. Those who are more finely organized or born in a peer age may recognize them as episodes to that great poem, which all poets, like the cooperating thoughts of one mind, have built up since the beginning of the world. Same revolutions within a narrow sphere had place in ancient Rome, but the actions and forms of its social life never seem to have been perfectly saturated with the poetical element. The Romans appear to have considered the Greeks as the selectest treasuries of the selectest forms of manners and of nature, and to have abstained from creating in measure, language, sculpture, music, or architecture, anything which might bear a particular relations to their own condition, while it should bear a general one to the universal constitution of the world. We judge from partial evidence, and we judge perhaps partially. Ennius, Varro, Cuvius, and Accius, all great poets, have been lost. Lucretius is in the highest, and Virgil, in a very high sense, a creator. The chosen delicacy of expression of the latter are as a mist of light which conceals from us the intense and exceeding truth of his conceptions of nature. Livy is instinct with poetry, yet Horace, Catullus, Ovid, and generally the other writers of the Virgilian age saw man and nature in the mirror of Greece. The institutions also and the religion of Rome were less poetical than those of Greece, as the shadow is less vivid than the substance. Hence, poetry in Rome seemed to follow rather than accompany the perfection of political and domestic society. The true poetry of Rome lived in institutions, for whatever of beautiful, true, and majestic they contain could have sprung only from the faculty which creates the order in which they consist. The life of Camillus, the death of Regulus, the expectation of the senators in their godlike state, of the victorious Gauls, the refusal of the Republic to make peace with Hannibal after the Battle of Cannae, were not the consequences of a refined calculation of the probable personal advantage to result from such a rhythm and order in the shows of life. To those who were at once the poets and the actors of these immortal dramas, the imagination beholding the beauty of his disorder created out of itself according to its own idea. The consequence was empire, and the reward ever-living fame. These things are not the less poetry quia current vate sacro. The episodes of that cyclic poem written by time upon the memories of man. Now that is truly poetic. I want to write to read it again. They are the episodes of this cyclic poem written by time upon the memories of man. The past, like an inspired rhapsodist, fills the theater of everlasting generations with their harmony. And Matt, I think that this paragraph is awesome, okay? Because I think that Shelley, do my opinion, I know that that you look down on Rome, but maybe one day you will change idea. But I think that the genius of Rome was not in the same things than Greece. And precisely the Greek were brilliant philosophers and creators, poets and architects and all those things. But the poetry of the Romans precisely is their political genius. And that's true that it was empire, but there was a very refined balance between monarchical institution, aristocratic institution, and democratic institutions in ancient Rome, especially in the first phase of empire, who was not called empire, between 200 BC and let's say 27 BC, when Augustus declared himself Princeps Senatus. But I stop here because I don't want to sing the glory of Rome. I just want to say that that paragraph is in.
Well, I was thinking about that, like the there's so many periods in history, including in the 20th century USA, which are, that if you had somebody of the mind of a Shelley or a Shakespeare, looking at the material that JFK or FDR and his battles had left to the world, there's so much material to make wonderful drama. But America didn't produce a lot of drama of a high quality during the 20th century. A little bit, but nothing of that type of sort that he's talking about. So it's like, it reminded me a little bit of the honor, the statecraft of, Regulus, like he's describing, and the dramas of people's lives just having been lived within Rome a certain way, usually upholding certain honor systems and overcoming or great challenges. There's a lot of content for great artists, even though they weren't themselves producing the type of artist that you had, like that was coming out of ancient Greece, like Aeschylus or Sophocles.
Yeah, I just want to add something that will last 30 seconds, okay? In my mind, Rome, by her institutions, created a poem, okay? And that poem is a poem of the true democratic man. Okay, the first level of the divine kingdom, man motivated by justice and honor. Okay, precisely you were speaking of the Coxus Honorum, that each Roman of patrician or of a high level family needed to go through that cursus honorum, because precisely Rome was a poem of the democratic man, justice and honor, or maybe just the honor, but that's a
Yeah,
long discussion.
they weren't
So I
big on
keep
justice.
on. Yeah, that's true. I agree with you.
Yeah.
It's more honor than justice, but at least it's at least 50% of the true
It's moving there.
democratic.
It's funny. I was
That-
I'm rereading Augustine's City of God. I spent the day doing that today, and he spends a lot of time criticizing the cultural the theater of Rome, and also their religious institutions that were tied to, you know, different gods wanted different types of plays enacted in different types of songs, and everyone, you know, he's writing this when Rome is collapsing. And it's really popular to blame Christianity for the collapse of Rome, and the fact that, you know, it's because we stopped, you know, doing sacrifices to our old pagan gods, and that's why the gods are punishing us now by this whole collapse and everything is happening. And it's really fun to like listen to. And Augustine is such a Platonist. Like he's really just citing Plato all the time as his source, and Cicero. And he's like, look at Cicero. He was already criticizing Rome morally way before Jesus was even born, and he's basically laying out that we've just become degenerate. Like we're honoring degenerate acts, and we're mistaking what is virtue for what is vice, and calling vice something honorable, and just going through like examples after like all sorts of examples, even though there's something good. He's like, if you go back to the original founders of Rome, there was something really good, and that's why the system endured for so long. But it was like you guys were corrupt before Christianity got around. But there's still something good there that could have been salvaged. It was too late by the time Augustine was writing, of course. That was I think they had too many Neros by that time to turn the boat around.
Okay.
But I'm just looking at the time though. It's 10 o'clock. It's 10
Okay.
o'clock. And we're at the near halfway mark, almost exactly.
Yeah, we're at page 11 exactly.
So it's probably a good time to stop for tonight, and then we'll pick up part 2 tomorrow, next Wednesday.
Very good. Anyway, I want to read a third time that line. They are the episodes of that cyclic poem written by time upon the memories of man. That is sheer poetry.
You gotta use that in your next essay, Juan.
Yeah, sure.
Any other parting thoughts before we close it up for today? It was a lot, but it's a good introduction. I think what we'll do next week too, I'm going to try to find a little poem by Shelley, which we could also read as to get his poetry and his prose together. Really revolutionary stuff that he does. And I'll send out the Alma Deutscher thing as well, which is really, this girl does incredible music. It's like I said, it shouldn't exist, but it does. Thank God. All right, guys. So it's a pleasure, and I'll see you all hopefully next week. And this Sunday, I'm gonna do a class on Thomas More, and maybe Augustine, and maybe some Plato. I don't know yet, but yeah, Sunday.
Ciao.
All right.
Bye.
Bye, everyone.
Thank you. Bye. Have a good night.
Thanks.
Bye.
Bye.